I will start. So, hi and
Mhm.
welcome to the Adversity Psychologist podcast. I'm Dr. Tara Quinterillo, and today, all the way from New York, I have Christopher Zara with me. I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what's brought him on today. Hi, Christopher.
Hello, thank you, Tara, for having me. Yes, my name is Christopher Zara, and I am a senior editor at Fast Company magazine in New York City. I recently wrote a memoir called Uneducated, and it's about my journey navigating the white-collar professional world without a college degree, and with really not a lot of schooling at all. So it's a book about how education is this powerful defining characteristic in our society, whether you have a proper education or not. So that's the book I just wrote. It's called Uneducated, and that's what brought me on today.
And you have really interesting backstory that we're going to delve into as well. But also, particularly, we're going to bring in social anxiety. So, some of the kind of extraneous things that might have impacted you and how you function in your career. So, I think actually those things are going to flow really nicely for listeners. So, if you're comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
do you mind telling us a little bit about your kind of journey with education? Because those kind of early years weren't easy for you, were they?
Yeah, no, they were not. So I was actually not a bad student in the first couple of years of school. I went to
Right.
Catholic school in up until about I think it was fourth grade is when I stopped Catholic school, and the rules of Catholic school kept me in line pretty
Right.
well. And I was so afraid to get in trouble as a little kid that I didn't I was very quiet and didn't break the rules. And things moved along pretty nicely. I started to have issues with keeping up with other students. I think probably around middle school, sixth, seventh, eighth grade, and by high school, I was really failing as a student. I was getting
Right.
all D's. Certain subjects were fine, but like there was a lot of I had a lot of issue with uh, reading, with spelling, just basic stuff like
Yeah.
that. And I guess that sort of coincided with a personality conflict where I started to act out. Um, I had been picked on a lot and when I was a younger kid, and then when I got older,
Okay.
when I went through the teenage years,
Yeah.
I started to act out a lot. I mouthed off to teachers. I set things on fire. I did a lot of things you're not supposed to do in school. And in high school, I'd say 11th grade, they were done with me, and they eventually just told me not to come back. Told my mom they didn't want me back, and so I was
Right.
essentially ejected from high school. I got sent to a special school after that. It was a special, what they call special education. Um, here in
Right.
the here in the U.S., there's certain conditions you can be certain classifications that get you this special education, and for me, it was emotionally disturbed, is what the label
Right.
they used.
Even the
Not a great,
language is interesting, isn't it?
yeah, it's terrible language. No one likes that
Yeah.
term.
Yeah.
Even today, it's still used at the federal level to classify children,
Really.
and no one seems to like it. It has a checkered backstory in terms of like how this term got into use and the actual
Yeah.
clinical definition of it, but for some reason they still use it. This is like,
Yeah.
I went to school in the 80s, and this is like, 35 years later, and
It's
and they're
still
still
there.
using. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um,
And just I'm also thinking the impact of that on a young person to have that label, what it does to their image, their self-esteem, self-worth.
yeah, it wasn't great. And the school they send you to, like the special school or the special education school, is even worse than the regular high school. It's
Right.
basically like if you imagine all the kids who get kicked out of the regular high school, put them
Yeah.
all in the same school together, and then people wonder why there's problems. Well, it's because you essentially took all these kids who um, you didn't want to deal with in the regular school setting and
Yeah.
placed them all together. And a lot of these kids, like myself, had behavioral issues and things like that. So I didn't last very long at the special school. I was only there for a couple of months, and I just stopped going to that. So basically got kicked out of 2 high schools that year. And that was the end of school for me. I got a GED, which is what basically like a certificate in the United States.
Right.
It's the equivalent of a diploma, but that's about as far as I went. I took some classes at community college here and there, but I really didn't do much else in school, and it wasn't unusual. I was from a neighborhood where that was pretty normal. A
Yeah.
lot of I knew a lot of kids actually that didn't finish high school in my neighborhood. So like from my own perspective at that time, like I didn't think there was anything even that different about it. It wasn't until I started working in media and in journalism where most people, 90% of people have gone through, colleges and
Is it that
universities.
high? Wow. Is that in the US? That
Yeah,
figure?
it's interesting. I've actually recently been writing about the differences between the UK and the US
Ah, yeah.
in terms of like graduate levels in certain industries. And in media in our country, it's super rare now to have professional journalists without college level education. It didn't used to be. The newspaper
Yeah.
business used to be pretty working class, like, if you go back 30, 40, 50 years, it wasn't unusual. My mom worked in the newspaper business,
Did
and
she?
yeah, she was not a journalist. She worked in the data processing side, but she knew it. She said a lot of the newspaper writers at that time, it was not unusual for them to not have college degrees. But nowadays it is very unusual, and it was one of the things that struck me when I got into the business, how that I was basically this anomaly.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you know, are there reasons why? In your research, have you managed to uncover anything as to what's caused that shift?
Yeah, a few different things. One of the things that changed, interestingly enough, is that the newspaper business and the news business wasn't seen as that glamorous.
Right.
So it was a working class industry. It really still is in a lot of ways. You don't make a ton of money, but it became to be seen as more glamorous right around the time of the Watergate scandal,
Yeah.
in the early 70s, and especially the movie that came out, All the President's Men, starring Robert
Yeah. I
Redford, and
remember that. Yeah.
yeah, that actually inspired a younger generation of kids to want to be journalists. I'm not going to attribute all of the shift to that one movie, but
Yeah, of course.
that was one part of how we started to see this shift. There were a lot of other factors. A lot of industries at that time were becoming more educated in general, so there was just this shift toward
Yeah.
focusing on the college degree as a proxy for people's abilities and people's
Yeah.
qualifications. And that happened in not just journalism, but a lot of different businesses throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, and into the 2000s. So um, by the time 2000 rolls around, or 2005 rolls around, it's pretty much 90% of journalists
Wow.
at this point, based on surveys they've done. But yeah, one of the shifts was the journalism business became glamorous, and journalism schools um, courted them in a
Yeah.
way that there was a sort of the way journalism schools would talk about the business as if it were this higher calling, and it required this sort of specialized training.
Almost like
Um,
marketing
yeah,
kind of
yeah, there's
ploy in a way.
definitely a lot of marketing involved, and I like to sort of preface some of what I say about this with the fact that, like, I actually I'm not anti-college at all. In fact, I would like
Well, I was going to ask that, so it's interesting you brought that up. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I like, if I had my way, like, I would love to go back and go to Columbia J School. Like, I live near the Columbia University campus.
Right.
It's beautiful, and it's a question of opportunity in a lot of ways. Like, I talk about this subject, and people will sometimes stop me
Yeah.
and say, but why should society open up these industries to people who don't feel like the proper training is like a worthy goal. And I
Yeah.
like to stop
Yeah.
people there and say, I do think it's a worthy goal. I think the
But
question of,
interesting, because that's quite an inference, isn't it? Presuming
yeah.
that,
Hmm.
yeah.
It is. And it's funny because, like, I wish that I wish that I that things could have been different for me. I think there's a lot of people who feel that the problem is not people having college as an option. The problem is that college
Yeah.
is the only option, and not everyone has the access to college. Not everyone studies well in a classroom setting.
Absolutely. Yeah. So many things I want to ask you there. So I'm going
Yeah,
with it organically because we have a lot of things on the list, don't
yeah,
we?
because
But
I think
so
I
that's
might
really
be rambling a
interesting.
little.
No, absolutely not. This is so interesting. So isn't it, so when we're just looking at trends, so I'm obviously, as a psychologist, I have a certain level of education. There are certain things I have to have in order to practice. So there's some careers, I guess, where unfortunately there are these barriers, if you like, rules,
Yeah.
frameworks, and in a way that's understandable. But it's
Hmm.
so interesting, isn't it, that presumption, then society's presumption, or particular industries having a presumption that if you're not going to college, that it's about not valuing the career
Yeah.
pathway or the way to get there. But it's so interesting, there's so many factors that influence how many people
Right.
go to college or university for people in the UK. And are you comfortable talking about, so your student journey then? Because I know this is something you've talked about before on other
Hmm.
podcasts. That experience, the labels you've been given, the difficulties that you had, did you get any support? How do you look back over that time? Right from kind of starting school up to when you left for the second time.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get a ton there. I got basically no support from the school. I mean, the school system was really crowded, and I don't blame them.
Yeah,
I think a lot of the teachers at that time, they just didn't want to deal with the
yeah,
delinquent, which is what I was. And so I don't blame, it's not like I blame the school, but I do think
yeah,
there was a systemic issue where it was so crowded, and the teachers are all underpaid. They're not babysitters. They're not there to deal with kids
yeah,
like
yeah.
me
That's
who
their
had.
points. Yeah,
So I
yeah,
didn't get a lot of support from the school system. I have a great family, but at that time, my parents were getting a divorce. They were not especially
right.
present
Yeah,
either.
yeah. Lots
And
going
so,
on then.
yeah, so it was during that period, this whole thing with this special education, there was no support at all because, like, I didn't think I needed it.
Yeah,
I just figured, okay, that's the end of school, and, like, I'm gonna go out and live my life now. And I thought it would be pretty easy. It wasn't until like 10 years later, and I'm still working as an ice cream scooper at a Haagen-Dazs in a shopping mall, and I'm like, what am I doing with my life here?
yeah. Is it right to ask a bit about that then? So we've already brought in, I need to hold some of these things to mind for later, just, looking at the journey you had, the support you had, it didn't have, looking at kind of society's expectations around education, what you need, college in particularly.
Hmm.
We'll come on to looking at the shift and, where businesses are heading these days and their views on having a college degree. But what was it like for you then? So in those early days when you left school and you're trying to earn a living,
Yeah.
is that something you're comfortable talking about? And what
Oh
led to
yeah.
that kind of
Yeah.
moment where you moved into the media industry, for example?
Yeah. So I mean, I, I had some issues with drugs. Like immediately after high school, there was this whole drug period where I got hooked on heroin, and this was like I'm in my late
Right.
teens, early 20s. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had to leave. I grew up in New Jersey, pretty close to New York City, but far enough away where the city was not part of my everyday life.
Yeah.
But you could buy drugs real easy in New York City, Philadelphia, all these big cities in the Northeast at
Yeah.
that time. They were like drug dens.
Yeah.
This is like the
Yeah.
early 90s. So I had to leave that area. So I left and I went down to Orlando, Florida, to get clean. And while I was down there, that's when working life started. I didn't have experience really doing anything. So I just
Yeah.
did
Yeah.
what most people would do, which is I went to, retail stores and applied for jobs,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Kind of
and
the
I did that.
door-to-door method, I'll go and talk to people
Yeah.
and see what I can get. Yeah.
Yeah. There was one point when I went to this place called Beefy King, which is It's it's like a burger
Now I need to
chain.
know what that is, right?
It's I don't think it's very well known outside of Florida, but I remember they didn't even want to hire me. I was like, I'm going to get a job at Beefy King. I was like really embarrassed that I even had to do it. I filled out the application and
Yeah.
they didn't even call me back. It's like I can't even get a call back from Beefy King.
So
So
when you're thinking about, your self-worth, your self-esteem at that time, when it's all right to ask, what was your mental health like at that time? So obviously being in recovery from addiction,
yeah.
facing rejection, what was that like for you?
Um, when I got the job at the ice cream shop in the shopping mall, it actually was not a bad time because I
Yeah.
was looking at it from at least I'm clean and sober.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that to me was like I'm doing better than I was 2 years ago. So like
Yeah.
I always
Yeah.
look at it as like the progression of where were you then. Now, objectively, I was a 28-year-old guy scooping ice cream for a living. So that might not look great on paper. But to me, I thought I was doing pretty good because like I had a
Yeah.
regular job,
Yeah.
paid $6 an hour, and like, I could afford to live on my own. I had a bunch of roommates. I couldn't live lavishly, but
You had that
but
independence, you could maintain
yeah,
your lifestyle.
yeah. So I guess you could call it arrested development, or um, I don't know. This is it took a long time for me to realize um, how behind I really was in terms of
Yeah.
like life, like normal life. People 28 years old are running companies. People 28 years old are doing important things, and here I was in a shopping mall. But I thought I was doing pretty good at that time. So my mental health then was pretty good. It wasn't until probably a few years later when I started to realize this is what my entire life is going to be. I have there's no plan. Like there was
Yeah. I
without
was wondering how long were you working in the ice cream place before you decided, what are my next steps? What were you noticing?
um I did the ice cream for like 3 years, and then I got a picture frame job where I was doing picture framing. I actually didn't mind that. You're
Yeah.
building picture frames, but it's still retail. You still have to deal with customers and stuff. I don't, and then I'm probably around 32 now. When I realize this is, I'm 8 years away from 40, and I'm still doing this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the wake up call where I realized I had to change direction and I had to figure something out, something new to do. And that's when I decided I would try to write for magazines. I pitched a magazine on a story, and I got an assignment on the first pitch. And to me,
Wow.
that was really like
Yeah.
an omen. It was like sort of like the universe saying, "This is what you're supposed to do." Now, granted, it was beginner's luck,
Yeah.
and I got a lot of no's after that point, but that first yes was really um, a way that was really a motivating factor for me to get that, someone
Was it
saying
an
yes.
area you were interested in? Is that right to us? Was there some value around writing for kind of publication media work or?
Yeah, I mean, I just in the sense that I always was told in school, like it's ironic that school was such uh, a bad experience for me, but I
Yeah.
did have a few teachers pull me aside and tell me that I was a good writer and
Ah,
told me
okay.
uh, uh, I knew that the feedback I was getting from the teachers was not, they weren't just saying it. Like they really thought they would, you know, pull me aside and basically say, your writing is above average and you should pursue this. Like I had teachers tell me that. So I always kind of knew that I was pretty good at writing,
Yeah.
it was the one thing I knew I could I even looked at it as something I could fall back on at some point. I just didn't know how to make money at it. And so this magazine thing was like, they were only paying me $100 or $125 for the story. But to me, that was like, wow, someone wants to pay me to do this.
Yeah.
It
For
was pretty,
something you've produced, that you've
yeah,
created.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's, yeah.
I'm
Um,
just wondering, what that's like for your self-esteem again, that having that autonomy to write what you want to write and people acknowledging that.
yeah. So it was the first bit of success that I had. And I started to freelance for a little bit, and then decided I'm going to come to New York City, which is
Okay.
I'd always been obsessed with New York City. I grew up close enough that I could visit when I was a teenager.
Yeah, I've been a few times. It's indescribable, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm just one of those people who got so captivated by it I could never leave it. I could never get it out of my system.
Yeah.
I moved around a little bit. I went to Orlando. I went to Seattle. I even
Right.
spent some time in Los Angeles. But I just couldn't get New York City out of my head. I just knew I wanted to be here, and um, part of it's because I love the lifestyle of not having to have a car, get to take the
Yeah.
subway, all the things that New Yorkers obsess about. And so I think when I was 35, I said I'm just going to go there and try to get a job in journalism, and it was really naive thinking that I could do that, but that's what I did, and I found this internship like the first week I was here
Gosh.
on at a newspaper called Show Business Weekly, which was one of these actor trade papers for the Broadway.
Yeah, I was reading about that. Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Like back in that day, back in the old days when actors wanted to get jobs in
Yeah.
theater, they would read these trade papers, and that's where they'd find all the auditions. And the bad timing in my case was I got there at 2005. The business model for that was already dead. So
Right.
the newspaper was essentially doomed, but I didn't know that. I just thought, wow, I'm interning at a newspaper called Show Business Weekly. I thought it was so great. And
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we were also going to bring in today was around social anxiety, which I'd read had begun to show up the more you were working in the
yeah,
kind of media industry.
yeah.
At that time, when you're suddenly surrounded by people, other writers, how did you find that? How did you find that as a new person on the scene with your kind of thoughts around your education, your history?
Yeah, this is when I think social anxiety really started to, I really realized what it was. Like,
Ah,
you,
that's interesting.
if you live your life a certain way where you can just make sure you're in comfortable situations, social anxiety doesn't present itself because you don't
Yeah,
put yourself in those situations where
absolutely. Yeah,
that triggers it. So when I came to New York and started working in this business where I really felt like an outsider, it triggered social anxiety and on a daily basis in ways that I just didn't anticipate.
yeah,
And there's some instances, like I can remember my first day on the internship where my boss, I'll call him my boss because he was, but he was like 12 years younger than me. Um,
yeah,
he
yeah,
hands me a couple things to edit. He's like, "Can you edit this?" It was my first day there, and I like froze up. I didn't like none of the words made sense. I forgot all the rules of grammar, and it was like I just thought, wow, it was like this imposter syndrome just took over,
yeah.
and I was just like, and that kind of stuff happened a lot where it was like, I would just freeze up in certain situations, and that that social anxiety is the kind of stuff that really hits you when you are in situations where you are not comfortable. And
Do you know what's really interesting? And I think this is a reason why I'm really glad to have you on is that we're kind of demystifying maybe what most people think is social anxiety, because a lot of people don't realize social anxiety is not about socializing with friends. It can
yeah,
show up in those situations,
hmm
but actually, it can show up in many different situations that involve being around other people. And in the work setting, I don't think people talk about that enough. Are you comfortable? I do tend to do a bit of a deep dive. What did you notice? How does it feel? So, for somebody that I guess we're point of this podcast as well, there may be people listening who don't know that that's them. What did you
yeah,
notice in terms of kind of thinking, how your body feels, emotions you had?
yeah. I mean, there's definitely some symptoms that are common in my case. Like uh, there's a heartbeat thing, for example. I
Yeah.
sit down in a meeting and I'm fine in the meeting because we're there with like a bunch of people and everything's okay. But when it's my time to talk in the meeting, all of a
Ah,
sudden the
yes.
heart
Yeah.
jumps up and like not just like speeds up, but pounds. Like, and I'm to the point where I think everyone can see my neck pulsating. And so that happens, and that's not pleasant.
Yeah.
Um,
I bet there's so many people listening that will resonate with.
yeah,
Um,
your hands shake. The thing that I think is probably the worst symptom for me, is like literally forgetting what you're trying to say,
Yeah.
and the syntax of language and all those things that that come to you when you're speaking normally. They're just kind of like, I don't know, it's like something comes out
Yeah.
and sucks it out of your mind or something. So now all of a sudden you're just standing there. I might even have notes and I can't read them because the words don't make sense. So those kinds of like things would happen to the extent to where I thought it was beyond the normal um,
Yeah.
nervousness. I know everyone gets nervous.
And that's important. Glad you brought that in as well. Differentiating between, a lot of people do experience very natural, normal anxiety in new situations.
Yeah.
You're going to suddenly speak up in a work meeting. But it's, the kind of intensity, frequency of symptoms and how long they hang around for, the duration, the important things to keep an eye on. Can I also ask as well, did you notice, how did you behave as a result then? So as a psychologist, what we're quite interesting when we're formulating with people, trying to build up a picture, is when you've got all this, that literally, it's such a really powerful image for everyone, isn't it? That idea that your heart is pounding so much, you literally are expecting people to be able to see your neck pulsating. And then sometimes we begin to then have thoughts about that. Oh no, people are going to look. So you almost have like a secondary circle of symptoms and worry. And that's obviously important because that actually can maintain the issue. We then get fearful next time we're in a meeting, or next time we've got to speak up, or we're around other people. How did it make you behave? What did you do to try and cope with that when you're noticing all of this stuff and the words are blurred and you've forgotten what you want to say?
Well, there was a lot of self-judgment. I would do it. I'd make myself do it. I mean, I couldn't run out of a meeting. So you have to plow through. And then I would, afterwards, just berate myself. And sorry if my loud neighborhood is not cooperating today.
I can't hear it.
Oh, good. Yeah,
Wish I could. Be nice to hear.
It was an airplane. So I would berate myself and really, judge myself harshly as like, basically like, what is wrong with you? Because I don't think I quite knew that this was such a common condition. I thought there was something seriously wrong with me. Later on, I did talk to a doctor about it, and I ended up getting this prescribed, what's called a beta blocker. And this goes back to what you were saying about the fear of the symptoms showing up is part of the problem.
It is.
Yeah, this beta blocker, all it does is really kind of mask some of those symptoms. Like the heartbeat is a lot better when and you take one right before you go into a meeting. It's really just for performance anxiety. It's like, I think a lot of musicians take it to keep their hands steady when they're
yes, I've heard that.
Yeah. So it really works for that. And what the best thing about it is that, like, it doesn't affect your mind at all, but what it does is it gives you the confidence to know that those symptoms aren't going to be as bad as they normally would. And that confidence allows you to then just be yourself.
So in a way, it kind of slows that cycle down, or even perhaps breaks the cycle of. And that's something I think that most people might not know about things like social anxiety, but also with panic attacks, panic disorder, that sometimes that second circle, so you might initially notice some symptoms, as you say, negative thoughts, physical symptoms, your heart pounding, maybe you're noticing that you're feeling anxious, what your emotions are. But then we start to appraise that, don't we? Oh my God, this isn't going to be good. Or what are people going to think of me? Or now you say you're berating yourself. What's wrong with you? Come on. And then actually those symptoms can become the thing actually that maintains. They can sometimes be worse than the initial physical symptoms or the initial observations. So, obviously medication is one route. Is there anything else that you've tried, anything else that you've found that works for you? If you've gone through your career, what words of wisdom, what nuggets of advice could you give people that might be listening now going, this is me? Because I think we don't talk about this enough.
I think, interestingly, I'm just discovering now that having written this book was extremely therapeutic.
Really?
Because part of the book is, social anxiety, and imposter syndrome. I feel like an outsider at work because I don't have a college degree. I was so terrified to talk about education at work. Like I was just terrified that someone would, just the subject comes up all the time because of course it's a natural thing for people to talk about. And then people, I just was afraid someone
Yes.
would be like,
Yeah.
hey, Zara, where did you go to school? And then I would, and then I'd have to say, well, I got kicked out of high school and here we are.
Is that what? So is that all right to ask as well then? Again, kind of raw today, aren't we? How have you replied throughout your career? Has it been fairly static that you tell people that story? Have there been times where you felt you don't want to share that?
I usually would say, I would say I took an unusual path. I would be really vague,
Yeah.
basically. I
Yeah.
didn't get specific. So I think most people didn't know that, I would really try to avoid the topic. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I was pretty successful at that. I think a lot of people, I'm sure my bosses eventually knew because they look at your resume, um, but a lot of people that you work with, if it doesn't come up, they don't know.
Yeah.
And to get back to the original question about what other things I've done to cope, actually, because I wrote the book, I've had to like talk about this topic now so much at work
Yes.
that
Yeah.
I, the fear is gone. And so I guess in a way that's a way to cope, is to actually, I think, maybe not
Talking
everyone's going
about
to,
it, naming it.
yeah, exactly. Maybe not
Yeah.
everyone's going to write a book, but like definitely talking about it seems to help
Yeah. It's a
in a
really
way
common
that,
thing with anxiety that we avoid. If I
yeah,
try and make it go away, try and push those feelings down, or maybe distract myself in some way,
yeah,
but
yeah,
usually it will pop up. We don't have control of when those negative thoughts are going to pop up. We often don't have control of some of the triggers. But actually, sometimes we refer to that as leaning in. I'm going to lean in and
yeah,
notice and name, wow, what is this? Wow, there is that really fast heartbeat. And sometimes that can just take the wind out of the sails a little bit, take a bit of the power out
yeah. It's
of
true.
the
I'm saying that,
anxiety as well.
and that's surprising to me because I would have
Yeah.
thought the opposite. I would have
Well,
thought,
yeah.
wow,
Yeah.
if you talk about it, it's actually acknowledging it and giving it power, and that makes it worse. And maybe
Yeah.
that's true for some people, and maybe that's true in certain situations or circumstances. But in this case, I have to say, having to talk about this topic now so much more frequently than I used to, I do feel better about it.
Yeah.
And
So
I
thinking
and I
even
do,
now, so obviously you've written your book, but then you'll be on podcasts, you'll be talking in other media outlets, you'll be verbalizing it as well as writing it down, which
yeah.
is actually really, really good combos. That do you notice, even as we're talking now, is it all right to ask, do you notice anything different when you're talking about it compared to previously?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't talk about it in most cases, and so I noticed that like the symptoms are a lot less than they used to be. The anxiety, social anxiety, to get back to the original um, description, is really about being in uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
Work is a lot more comfortable now, only because everyone seems to know my skeletons.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's had a weird, maybe counterintuitive impact
Yeah.
of like just me not caring as much, and the not caring makes the anxiety go away. It's the caring that I think.
I'm so glad you said that. I think it's a really nice way to present that to people, that sometimes we can invest so much effort, kind of emotionally or physically, into pushing away the feared thing. But
Yeah,
when we kind of drop that effort or drop the rope, if you take the tug of war metaphor that we might argue and, tug against our anxiety, and the anxiety might win one day and we might win another day. It's really effortful, but to just be able to drop the rope and have a look at what's going on can actually be really quite freeing for people. So in
yeah.
your industry then, is it, so you at the moment you work for Fast Company. Tell us a little bit
Mhm.
about what you do, because you've done really well in your career, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Fast Company is one of the
Yeah,
leading business magazines in the United States. It's
this
very
is
well
incredible.
liked in certain.
Yeah,
It's very well liked in certain circles with tech and the startup world, and
yeah,
the main focus is business and innovation. I loved it even before I worked there. My wife was a big fan of it. They cover a lot of
right.
design and things that are just kind of cool technology things that are happening. Um, and my role is the news editor. I run the news desk, so I get to basically touch all the topics that they cover on a daily basis, and it's a lot of fun. You know, I I am really lucky in the sense that it's a great place to work, and not a business that has these like big layoff cycles like a lot of these companies that you hear about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
In
they've been
current
really,
times as well.
yeah, it's a rough year. I don't want to speak too soon, but it's been a rough year
Mm.
for the media business. It's always seems like the media business is going through a transition. I write actually a little bit
Yeah.
about this in the book, because I started out at this newspaper that the minute I got there, it was like already over. And
I read
I,
that about you. Yeah.
yeah. So the first 5 years of my journalism career was really trying to save this newspaper that really was beyond saving,
Mm.
because the business model was dead. This was the Show Business Weekly.
Yeah.
I left that because they went out of business, and I went to a website called International Business Times, which was an online only media outlet that was really fast growing. This was the era of like Business Insider and
Mm.
Huffington Post, and all these companies were trying
Yeah.
to find this new model of, you know, online journalism. BuzzFeed was another one. They were really
Yes.
huge,
Yeah.
huge at this time. And that felt like it was going to just go on forever for a while, because it was fast growing, and it was there was a lot of money coming in. There was a lot of excitement around that business model, and it too also collapsed, in the sense that the ad model
Yeah.
for those websites wasn't sustainable, because it was all built on growth and scale, and you
Right.
can only get so big. And you have all these competitors doing the same thing you're doing, so it gets really crowded really fast. And so
I can imagine. Yeah.
3 years, 4 years later, IBT, that also collapsed. So I got to watch the collapse of two very different business models in journalism in the very short time that I had been working there. And that's when Fast Company happened. I had a friend who needed help on the news desk as an editor, and I got pretty lucky in the sense that I already had an in with this person, and
Yeah.
I've been there ever since. I've been there for 7 years. Um, and they've been really supportive of this project of Uneducated, the book that I wrote. Um, I had to tell my editor in chief when I first was writing the book, "Hey, I'm going to write a book about, being a high school dropout and working for your company." Um, I didn't know
What were
how
you
to go.
met with? Tricky question then. What were you met with when you put that to them?
Stephanie Mehta, who was the editor in chief at that time, was immediately supportive and immediately saw
Wow.
the value in the story I was trying to tell. She said, I think her
I'm really
exact
glad.
words were, "It's about time someone's telling this kind of story." We have since covered the issue of uh, college degree requirements in a lot of different ways at Fast Company. So it's already a natural topic for us to be writing about. And here I was kind of living it, in the sense that
Yeah.
uh, my career journey was really the first there's been a lot of times in my life where like I was kept out of a job because of my lack of a degree.
Yeah.
um
Is it something that could lead to change? What's your ideal? So, you started those tricky conversations, as we call them. You're
yeah
getting your book out there. What would you like to see happen? What's your ideal with that, in terms of a core shift, maybe?
yeah I think the policy side of it is tricky, and I think hopefully people smarter than me will figure out a
Yeah.
better way forward. I would say, in a broadly speaking, if we could have a system that's a little bit less dependent on that one signal, the signal
Yeah.
being the college degree, and a system that was a little more fair, in the sense that it recognized other skills, other types of training, and other pathways besides just a college degree.
Yeah.
This would help. This would help a lot of different parts of our society. One issue with college right now is the cost of it.
Well, absolutely.
Um,
Yeah. I'm thinking who's
and
excluded, not just maybe in terms of academic attainment, but
yeah,
finances.
exactly. And a part of the reason it's so expensive is because they can charge that much, because the focus and the
Yeah.
importance of college is so out of whack right now that the colleges kind of know they can charge whatever they want. People have to pay the tuition because they need the degrees to be able to have a life. So if we
So
had a
you've got that
system,
perfect vicious circle almost, haven't you? Or
yeah,
perfect storm there.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So if we had a system where you didn't necessarily, you could have other pathways. The college was one, but you could also have, it wasn't solely based on college. I think that the schools would have to re-examine their systems and
Yeah.
they would have to figure out ways to bring their costs down so they're not putting people in this enormous debt, you know.
It's another huge issue, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think that, like, if you to answer the original question, like if we had a system that was a little more fair in the sense that it wasn't so geared toward college, that there were other pathways that were just as viable and that could lead to really good paying jobs. I think that's what I would like to see. So people like myself who didn't necessarily do well in a school setting could still find a high paying job, maybe a high skills job. I mean, there's lots of skills you could still acquire without sitting in a classroom
Absolutely.
for 4 years.
So I was going to ask you that. What are people missing out on then? So when you think of your own company, so these people are being excluded left, right, and centre, for financial reasons or because their background has meant they haven't been able to get the qualifications to get to college. What is the society? What are businesses? What are they missing out on as well? When we look at it from that perspective as well,
I think,
by not having someone like you doing what you're doing every day.
I think that they're starting to realize what they're missing out on. There are a lot of companies now that are relaxing their degree requirements. Google is one example. IBM, Delta Airlines recently said.
So I didn't know that. Right.
Yeah. Part of it's the conversation is the conversation is someone that people are having. The pandemic happened. The labor market got really tight in a lot of areas, and so these companies had to rethink their pipelines because they were facing labor shortages. So part of it's necessity. One example is Delta Airlines recently said you can be a pilot and you don't need to be a college graduate. Now they're still going to prefer college graduates, but I think that just the fact that they're not going to shut you out of the entire pilot pool just because you don't have college degrees, because they're facing pilot shortages. So I guess what they're missing out on is a more inclusive workforce and possibly a workforce that has skill sets that they didn't have, that people didn't have before. Because when you have a system where everyone goes through the same schools, you're going to have a sort of homogeny of the same types of people coming through.
That kind of just richness, is that the right word?
That might richness.
Missing,
certainly diversity. I mean, there's a lot of these groups that are trying to open up these talent pipelines will point out that people of color are unfairly kept out of the workforce based on college attainment, because statistically that people of color are less likely to obtain a college degree. So you have that issue of it too. And so just by virtue of opening up the workforce to people without college degrees, you're going to have a more diverse workforce.
And actually it's solving quite a few issues, isn't it? What's next for you then? So your book's out. Where do you want to go with that? What are your next steps? Have you got that far yet?
I haven't really thought about next steps. I really hope that I hope that this book opens up a conversation about education. I think there's a lot when we talk about education, there's a lot of college bashing that goes on now on one side. Often the college bashing is coming from people who went to college, which is kind of funny. And then there's a lot of people who who will still look down on you for not having the college degree. So we have these two sides.
There's still some kind of stigma there, is there? And you've been in receipt of that, have you, as well?
Yes, I have. I think I would like to see I would like to see both sides talk to each other a little bit more, where
Yeah.
we can try to not use education as this fault line in our society. I don't understand why it has to be that way. Um, but every poll you look at will say, here's what college graduates say, here's what non-college graduates say. And,
I was
it's
going to
like,
say, we're bombarded with it online and social media,
yeah,
aren't we? From our
yeah,
everyday conversations. Sometimes, generations will pass down to the next generation. This is the expectations, we're kind of in a mold, so to
yeah,
speak. Is
exactly.
what
Yeah,
how
exactly.
much
I mean,
autonomy is there?
yeah.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
so in terms of getting you out there, so I think many people in the UK listening to this will be so interested. How can they find out more about you? Where do you hang out online? How can we find more about you?
Well, I hang out at fastcompany.com. That's where I do still write. I'm mainly the news editor now, so I'm mostly editing, but I still try to write occasionally. And you can find the book anywhere that books are sold. It's called Uneducated. You can buy it at Amazon or Barnes and Noble or um, bookshop.org or any any place that books are sold. And I'm also on Instagram. I try not to be on Twitter so much these days. And if you're familiar with what's going on at Twitter,
Yes.
you might know why. But
I got muddled up when I looked at my phone and the app had changed, and I was like, "What is this?"
yeah, exactly. I don't even know what we're supposed to call it now. I
Yeah,
still have
I
to
don't
use
either.
it.
Yes, by the time this is out, and if people are listening, I don't know, in years to
Yeah,
come,
who
they'll be like,
knows?
"Oh."
You're like, what's
So we're
Twitter?
talking about the social media platform where you only have a few words you're allowed to say at once, so whatever it is
Yes.
named in the future. I've
Um,
also found you on LinkedIn and Instagram already, so I'm already stalking you
yes.
on there.
Yeah. So LinkedIn and Instagram are probably the two I use the most. LinkedIn is very work focused, and we write a lot about work life culture. Um, and so I'm on those two platforms. And of course, I'm pretty easy to find. As a journalist, I try to make myself always available. You never
Yeah,
know when you're going to get a news tip, a
yeah.
source. There's a lot of journalists out there that are really hard to find. I'm not one of them. You could email me and I will answer it,
It's a
in
really
most
interesting
cases.
world, the media world. I'm still trying to get my head around it myself, but I find it really, really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I always
Um,
find it interesting when journalists are really hard to contact, but
yes, yeah, that
some
is
of them,
interesting.
yeah.
I want to know. Maybe I have to get another one on to see why. Why is that? um, I always like to ask my guests. So I've learned so much today, actually. Um, if you were to leave us with one little adversity takeaway, what might that be?
I would say there's a theme, I think, in the book that I didn't intend to be there, but I think the theme is to not give up.
Yeah,
So I really believe in not giving up. And sometimes not giving up just means not necessarily achieving the thing you set out to achieve, but retooling and being willing to revisit your goals and
yeah,
change them accordingly. If you had asked me what I was going to do with my life at when I was that teenager who got kicked out of high school, I probably would have said, part of me would have said I won't be alive till when I'm 21, because I was in this, like, there's this whole punk rock thing where, like, you're not
yeah,
supposed to ever get old, right? So I would have probably said that. And if I didn't ever like reevaluate this punk rock identity that I created for myself, there's no way I would have succeeded at anything. And there are people who go through their entire lives clinging to that identity that they form as teenagers.
yes, yeah. That's a really interesting point. That kind of the ability to be flexible, to evolve,
Yeah,
doesn't mean you can't still connect and identify with those things that are important to you,
exactly. And you
but you
should.
can
And I
evolve.
think exactly. So the takeaway, I think, would really be, don't be afraid to reinvent yourself, and don't be afraid to even contradict the person you were as a kid. I think it's harder now
Yeah.
because we live our
Yeah.
lives online. People say things, you might tweet something, and now you're like, oh, I got to stick with that because I tweeted it.
Yeah.
um, I think you really have to be able to reevaluate things and reevaluate even your own identity sometimes and the things
And
you
not being
believe.
scared to then as well. I've just picked up from you there that, we might have little barriers. I can't do that or I shouldn't do it. But a bit like with the social anxiety, lean into that a bit and do it
Yeah,
anyway.
that was a big lesson for me. Yeah, I'm really glad that I discovered that because I was probably the type of person who would have said, "Don't talk about it and it'll go away."
Yes.
And I'm really glad that I learned that in this case, talking about it was actually the thing that made it better.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that I've come across you because I always
Yeah, me
love
too.
having
This is
people. I've had quite a few guests from the USA on. Um,
yeah. This,
but your book, I think, is something people really need to hear about. Go grab a copy if you're listening now. It's in the show notes. You've only got to click. There it is, nice and easy. And talk about it. Don't just read the book, but talk about it. Talk about it with people. Let's use it to create some change as
I
well.
hear
Sometimes,
it's really big in book clubs. So if people want to start a book club
yes,
and
that's a good, yeah, perfect
yeah.
setting. Because I kind of think sometimes we read things that we, find really interesting or profound, but we don't always necessarily then share that with other people. And that, for me personally, is the magic of books. Is it
Yeah,
creates conversations. Look what we're doing now.
that's
Christopher, it's been so lovely having you. And I always say to my USA guests, I appreciate because you're getting up super early for me with the time difference.
yeah, no,
Um,
thank you so much for having me on. This was such a great conversation. I'm so glad we did it.
and you're off on a super big trip as well. So go and have that well-deserved break as well. Because even people in the
Yes,
media, you need to switch off and look after yourselves as well.
and you as
Good
well.
for
I
all
hope you have
elements.
I
We
hope
are.
you
We're
have
probably
safe
going to fly over the
travels.
top of
Yeah.
each other. We're heading in the same direction, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're both
I'd,
hoping
lo-
that the weather's going to be all right. We're not going to get too stuck in the rainy season.
I'd love to check in with you and see what you thought about that part of the world and
Absolutely, I would love to. I'd love to. Maybe bring that into an episode. The
yeah.
importance of self-care and travel. Absolutely. I'd love to stay in touch with all guests that I have on. I'm not a tokenistic person, so I really love to connect and to continue to connect and follow what people are doing and check in. So it's been lovely to have you. And
Yeah, you too.